Now this tutorial will go over a little bit of information regarding the red blood cells. So again, you want to know the two names, RBCs and erythrocytes. And the main function of erythrocytes would be to transport gas, whether that is oxygen or carbon dioxide. And it will transport these gases between the lungs and the different cells. The RBCs have a protein, and that protein has the ability to carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. The protein is known as globin. And because that protein, globin protein, is circulating in the blood, we name it hemoglobin. It is a relative of myoglobin, which is that same protein, but it stores oxygen in the muscle tissue. We named that myoglobin. Okay. The red blood cells have the shape of a biconcave disc, as you can see down here. They're very tiny in size. They actually do not they lack a nucleus, so they don't have a nucleus. They don't have any of the organelles like mitochondria or DNA or RNA, which means they basically don't have the ability to produce lots of energy. Because of the lack of mitochondria, they can only produce energy through glycolysis, but they can go through the aerobic phases of cellular respiration. And due to the lack of DNA and RNA, again, they can't make proteins. They don't have the ability to divide or to go through mitosis, which means that the lifespan of a red blood cell is a very short life, okay? And we continuously have to keep on producing fresher and new RBCs all the time throughout our life. So erythrocytes have this very short lifespan. It's about 120 days, which comes up to about 4 months, and that's it. The bone marrow is the factory that produces erythrocytes, and the bone marrow is stimulated to produce erythrocytes due to the effect of a hormone known as erythropoietin. Erythropoietin comes from the kidney, and from the kidney, that hormone will circulate through the blood until it reaches the bone marrow and stimulates it to produce erythrocytes. The production of erythrocytes is known as erythropoiesis. Now, what happens to that erythrocyte 120 days later? Well, first off, remember that how all of our blood has to be filtered through the spleen, and then the spleen is going to filter and remove all of those old erythrocytes. Again, old is a very relative term, so in this case, it's only 120 days old. And then after being removed by the spleen, those old RBCs are going to move on to the liver, and the liver is going to metabolize the RBC and break it down into its different components. One of those components would be iron. Well, the body is a very conservative being. It doesn't want to just dump iron into our feces or into the urine. We would like to recycle that iron, and that's what the body would do. The body will take that iron from the liver, transport it back to the bone marrow to reuse it to make new RBCs. Iron cannot be transported on its own. It has to shuttle on a protein, and that protein is known as transferrin. Trans means to transport something, and ferrin means iron. So we all know that the symbol of iron is Fe. So transferrin is that protein that transports iron in the bloodstream from the liver to the bone marrow. Okay. But that's obviously not the only source of iron. Okay. We take in iron with diet, and we need to have extra storage of iron, which we do. So our iron is also stored in cells like the liver cells, spleen cells, and cells of the small intestine. And again, they have to be bound to a protein, and that protein is known as ferritin. Okay, so you want to know the difference between transferrin and ferritin. Transferrin, again, the name tells you that I'm transporting iron, while ferritin is how we store iron attached to that protein in the liver, spleen, and intestinal cells. Now, this is what a life cycle of an RBC looks like. We are going to intake the different things that we need to make healthy RBCs, which are iron, folic acid, and vitamin B12. When we absorb those, all of these nutrients are going to go to the bone marrow, and erythropoietin, will stimulate the process of erythropoiesis. We make those RBCs. RBCs are going to circulate in the bloodstream for about 120 days, and then they'll be filtered out by the spleen, and they will eventually reach the liver. Now these old RBCs are going to break down, take that protein, that hemoglobin protein, and break it down into heme and globin. Globin is all protein, so globin is going to break down into its individual amino acids, and again, the body being the conservative being that we are, our body will reuse and recycle those amino acids. What about the heme? Well, heme will break down into biliverdin and iron, and remember that iron will be transferred back to the bone marrow to be recycled, and it has to be carried by the protein we call transferrin. Heme, on the other hand, also gives us biliverdin. Biliverdin will change into bilirubin, and that is going to be excreted in bile. It gives the bile its very characteristic greenish color. When it gets into the small intestine, when bilirubin gets into the small intestine, it undergoes changes due to the bacteria that's in there, and will change into stercobilinogen and stercobilin, and those are brownish in color. So our characteristic brown color of feces would be due to the change of bilirubin into these pigments. What are the requirements for the normal erythrocyte production? We already introduced those. Those are iron, folic acid, and B12. We need iron, obviously, because it's a component of the hemoglobin molecule, and that is how we are going to attach. That iron has the ability to attach to a maximum of 4 oxygen molecules. Folic acid is necessary because you see how much mitosis is involved in our cell division to make all of these RBCs. So you need lots of folic acid important for the formation of DNA and that normal cell division. And vitamin B12. We need vitamin B12 in order to have, which is required for the action of folic acid. And that's why during pregnancy, women are given, as part of their prenatal vitamins, iron, folic acid, and B12, because to keep up with their needs of themselves and the needs of the growing fetus. And I would like you at this point kind of go back and remember the importance of intrinsic factor and how important it was in order to absorb vitamin B12, and how pernicious anemia, which was the autoimmune destruction of cells in the stomach that produce intrinsic factor, which led to the inability to absorb vitamin B12, and that led to a kind of anemia that we called megaloblastic anemia. So that is kind of tying these two chapters to each other. This shows you how the kidneys, that relationship between the kidneys and the bone marrow, and how the kidneys stimulate the bone marrow to produce more erythrocytes. So when the body goes through a process or through a time of hypoxia, which is low oxygen levels, that hypoxia will be picked up by the chemoreceptors in the kidney, and it will stimulate the kidney to produce a hormone known as erythropoietin. Erythropoietin will reach the bone marrow through the bloodstream and will stimulate the bone marrow to increase the production of erythrocytes. So it basically increases the procedure that we've named erythropoiesis. Now, a little bit of some clinical issues that are related to RBCs. So first off, something that is physiological. So there's a normal variation between the amount of RBCs among genders. So females versus males. Males have what is known as a higher hematocrit value than women. Hematocrit is the percentage of RBCs in blood. So in men, that hematocrit values are higher than in women for several reasons. One of them happens to be that women go through menstruation every month, so there is loss of blood. And the second reason would be due to the testosterone levels in men. So testosterone stimulates erythropoietin production by the kidney, okay, and that obviously will stimulate erythropoiesis and increase the number of RBCs found in men. So now a couple of pathological things. So for example, patients that are undergoing renal dialysis or have chronic renal failure, well, obviously their kidneys aren't going to be producing any of that erythropoietin hormone, and that would lead to what is known as a secondary anemia. So your primary problem is the chronic renal failure, and the secondary problem is anemia. So the patient is anemic not because there's something wrong with the bone marrow, but because of the loss of the stimulation of the bone marrow by erythropoietin. Athletes who abuse or the intake of erythropoietin, unfortunately, there are athletes out there that kind of intake erythropoietin, which can be found in a synthetic form, to increase their stamina, thinking that more RBCs means increased stamina. I will be able to finish that marathon with no problem, which might be true. Okay, but on the other hand, you have the risk of the blood becoming too thick, high viscosities of blood, which can lead to blood clotting, can lead to heart failure, heart attack, and strokes. So what is anemia? And means no, emia means blood. So although we obviously don't mean that the patient doesn't have any blood, but it means the definition of anemia would be the decrease in the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. That could be either due to the decrease in the number of red blood cells, or the decrease in the amount of hemoglobin, or more commonly as a combination of both of these together. So one of the causes of anemia is a hereditary kind or a genetic kind known as sickle cell disease, also known as sickle cell anemia. It is a genetic mutation in the gene that codes for hemoglobin, where one amino acid is substituted with another one, and that leads to an abnormal kind of hemoglobin. Under normal conditions, everything is fine. Okay, the patient doesn't experience attacks or doesn't experience symptoms unless there is hypoxia, so low oxygen levels. So let's say they go into areas which are above maybe sea level, or they start exercising, or just things that are normal, we are exposed to normally, so stressful conditions. So anything that might decrease the oxygen levels are going to lead to the change of hemoglobin. That red blood cell, instead of looking like that, will change into the sickle shape, and that's where the name comes from. And normal RBCs have the ability to squeeze themselves into these very tiny capillaries. These sickled cell RBCs lose that ability. Okay, they'll get blocked, they'll get lodged into the smaller blood vessels, especially the capillaries. They are going to block the blood supply, which means that part of the tissue will not get any blood, so they can become gangrenous, and it leads to these very painful attacks of sickle cell anemia. Now, the major causes of anemia. So, we kind of talked about one specific kind, which is a genetic kind cause that led to the hemolysis or the destruction of the RBC, and we called that the hemolytic anemia, okay, due to the excessive destruction of erythrocytes. In the case of sickle cell anemia, that destruction was stimulated by hypoxia. But there are other more common causes of anemia. So for example, dietary deficiency of iron, B12, or folic acid, which were the things that we needed in order to make healthy RBCs. So iron deficiency anemia is actually the most common cause of anemia. And usually, most of the time, it really doesn't tell us much about the nutrition of the patient or the bone marrow status of the patient. It is really a reflection that there might be something else going on in the body. So usually iron deficiency anemia is secondary to another cause, another disease going on. Aplastic anemia. Aplastic anemia means that there is no synthesis of RBCs. So there's a failure of the bone marrow that bone marrow has been destroyed, whether it's due to radiation or toxins or exposure to different chemicals, or maybe there's cancer going on in the bone marrow that led to the complete failure of the bone marrow to make RBCs. Notice that a lot of times when there is bone marrow failure, it doesn't really target just RBCs. Well, there will be also leukopenia, which is the failure to make white blood cells, for example. So usually aplastic anemia is accompanied by the failure to make the other kinds of blood cells. Another kind of anemia is hemorrhagic anemia, where the patient has bled a lot, so maybe after surgery, and they bled a lot after surgery, and their RBC counts go way down. That is known as hemorrhagic anemia. Another kind of anemia, which we have already discussed, which is that secondary anemia in the case of chronic kidney disease, where again the patient lost the erythropoietin hormone stimulation, leading to a decrease in the overall erythropoiesis. In the next tutorial, we'll be talking about the white blood cells.